Hello, and welcome to Multi-Story. Cities contain a multitude of stories, some right in front of our faces and some below the surface, and we think it's important to interrogate them and tell them. And that's what we hope to do with this show. I'm Matt. I am a lover of cities and urbanism generally, and live in and explore cities as much as I can. I'm here with Tess, who is a professional urban planner who thinks about cities every day for a living, and Coletta, who thinks about cities maybe slightly less than us because she is a well-adjusted human being. Today, we are discussing an article that Tess shared with us. And Tess, do you want to go ahead and just tee up where you found it and like the general big picture of what it's about, and then we can dig into our reactions to it?
Sure. Well, I think I found it on Reddit, probably, as one does. But it's a local news story from San Diego about how public meetings have changed since the pandemic, and specifically like personal threats, profanity, accusations, just overall dysfunction and allusions to violence. And the article describes some scientific analysis of how public meetings in San Diego have been changing in terms of an increase in the number of aggressive or like uncivil comments during the meetings, and interviews a bunch of people about why they think that is. And I think, this isn't something that's surprising to anyone probably, but I think there's a lot in here related to planning and how cities work, and I'm interested to talk about it with you.
Yeah, I agree that it wasn't really surprising, but the sort of collation of it all into one article, looking at like the scope of the challenge in one community, was incredibly depressing. Like we've seen it episodically, like we've all seen a video, some posts of like someone accusing an elected official of being a pedophile or in the deep state or whatever. But just the fact that this is like not isolated, it is a phenomenon that is measurable and trackable and spiraling out of control is like, what are we doing with this whole experiment of democracy?
Right. And maybe there's always this sense that, um, well, things seem worse now because you're in the moment, right? But this was a good way to look at data and say, no, actually, things have been getting progressively worse and they didn't used to be this bad. And something is happening, and maybe something worth thinking about.
Yeah, it absolutely is getting worse. I mean, I think there's other data that's not stated in this article that shows that like threats against elected officials and just like general hate being strewn at them has gone massively up in the past several years. And I think it started before the pandemic, but certainly the pandemic made things significantly worse. And I thought it was interesting. One of the social scientists quoted in the article talked about people just having like a collective PTSD from the pandemic. And that's something that like is not acknowledged very much, I think. I feel like we just kind of like a lot of people have just like moved on, and it's like that thing that remember when that was happening, and we haven't really like dealt with it as a world of humans. So
Right,
I don't
right.
know, it's
There is
interesting.
a trauma response writ large in society, or a fear response, that is coming out of all of the challenges that people have been facing. And, it was interesting in the article, they talked about how, um, you know, someone who is frightened or anxious will gravitate towards ideas that help them to make sense of the world, or they will react in an aggressive way because that gives them a feeling of power, or control
Mm-hmm.
over a situation over which they have no control, right? So it's like, yeah, part of this is like we're just peeking just behind the curtain or beneath the surface here and just seeing at these meetings this manifestation of this deeper societal trauma that's going on.
Yeah, and it seems like, not to get further into the armchair psychologist kind of aspect of it, but from the article, it seems like there's a variety of sort of usual suspects that they end up encountering. Like the article profiles, like this individual comes to multiple meetings, which kind of reinforces that idea that like it's people who are scared and they're finding an outlet. And democracy requires, and the First Amendment protects their right to go to a meeting and yell at people, which we can talk about that third rail of like, what do we, should the First Amendment be so absolutist in contexts like this? But what struck me then is that, in a democracy that's supposed to be balanced, it's giving just an outsized weight to a few folks that are wanting to go in and throw a wrench into the system. And like that has serious implications for its ability to represent the rest of the people and the people's interests generally.
And for the elected officials to actually like hear from their constituents about what concerns are, because if it's one person that shows up all the time and screams constantly, like I promise you that those elected officials aren't listening to that person. They're just, when that person shows up, they're rolling their eyes, maybe internally, maybe externally, and they're like, oh, this person is here again to just like be loud and obnoxious. They're not actually thinking about that as like, this is a real concern. I mean, it's like any sort of communication amongst humans. If you just like scream at people, they're not necessarily going to listen to you. Like there's a few instances where that type of communication makes sense. But generally, if you're like trying to actually get a point across and you're screaming, like it doesn't make people listen to you more. It makes them like shrink up and like think you're crazy.
I think there's a question here, though, because in one sense, you can think about these public meetings as a platform for someone to try and reclaim some agency over their lives that they feel that they've lost, right? And what does that mean? But I think there's another sense here where we are more explicitly looking at these public forums as a tool of obstruction, right? What was supposed to be a tool for participation is becoming intentionally a tool for obstruction. And to bring it back to like cities and planning, it's very normal in planning to think about who is coming to your public meetings and are those voices representative and do they represent the needs and the desires of the larger community. And I think the new question is maybe not so much about what platform for engagement gets the most diverse and representative conversation, but whether or not that engagement process can even function, right? Will people engage will people engage with each other in good faith, or is this a case where people are very cynically and intentionally using engagement tools to obstruct the process, to silence other people, or to impose a viewpoint or outcome, or even in some cases to like intentionally try and isolate and disempower vulnerable people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think this is a thing that's happening. It's not just like, is this the best place for us to work through our feelings? It's like, are these tools being co-opted in an anti-democratic way?
And to echo a little bit of, I guess, both of your points, but what Coletta was saying about whether people are really hearing them, it's not just that the elected officials are sort of like overwhelmed and washed out by it, but like if I'm, on the other side of an issue of a person that's personally insulting and screaming at a council person, I'm not very likely to be super keen on going and testifying on behalf of a project in my neighborhood if I know that's what's on the other side and that threats are being made to the elected official. That's pretty scary for a citizen too, who has to take the time to go and do that to try to counter that. I mean, in a tiny way, we've had more of those experiences in just the advocacy that I've tried to do in our own community is that, like, the rhetoric is just uglier and more personal and more yelly and non-compromising. And I'm just like, you know what, I can't, this is not good for my mental health. Like, I'm emotionally invested in my community, and it sucks. So yeah, it's a existential democratic question.
Yeah. And, I think it's harder to shout someone down in a public meeting if it's your friend or family member or beloved neighbor, right? And that's part of what this article discusses, is that there used to be this bubble around local participatory democracy that was more insulated because there were these stronger personal social connections between these people. And there was some lamenting in the article that those connections are like fraying, right? And maybe that's true, but I think I find, even if I talk with my, you know, people who personally know me, or my own family, where it's not so much that the social bond has weakened, but the social bond is no longer strong enough to overcome this very powerful sort of social media marketing propagandizing technological infrastructure that has figured out how to get in people's brains, right? And so these are no longer conversations between people. These are individuals showing up where they believe the immutable forces of the world are acting against them, and they have to resist in any way they can, right? Like, the
Yeah.
whole perspective on what is happening in that space, I think, has changed.
I think that's absolutely true. Like, I think like the world has changed. I think about my personal life, and I have a lot of family members that have very different political views than me, and I'm not as close to them as I used to be. And some of that is like, I feel very uncomfortable with choices that you've made, and I don't want to talk to you about it. And we used to, like, I have cousins that I am on a different political spectrum than, and when we were in college, like, we had fun sort of debates about that. And now it's like, we're not going there. But I think certainly I have seen people thinking, like, having this concept of like elected officials almost not being human. Like, that if you're screaming at someone who's, especially, I don't know about San Diego, they probably get paid okay, but like, I have friends that are in small town city councils that like get paid a couple $100s a month. It's basically a volunteer job that they're like putting in all of this work to try to make their community better. And then to have just like the constituents that they're serving screaming at them and acting like they're there for some sort of terrible reason, it like limits the number of good people that you're going to get to do those things. And you're going to end up with people who like that sort of drama and want to just like live in a soap opera, being the people who run for elected office. Because why would any sane person want to sit there and like listen to crazy people yell at them all day long? Like, it doesn't work very well. And it is, I think, a bigger piece of our society being so polarized and so just kind of in different spaces where we're not acknowledging each other's humanity in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, the thing that threads both of your comments together in my mind was, I was thinking about, if you look at some of the narratives that people say in these meetings, back in the day, we might be like, all right, well, we feel very differently about national politics, but like today we're here to decide whether we should do a road diet on Walnut Street. But now, like, these people are coming in and saying, like, you should inject yourself with a untested vaccine, or you should go back to killing babies, so it's the nationalization of politics that's happened, that even on the local level, we're not talking about local issues, we're talking past local issues with this sort of political tribalism, or at least it seems like that's it. Like, I don't actually even know sometimes how these folks are linking their comments to the issue that's being discussed. To your point, Tess, about sort of the performance of it, like, It's someone up there grandstanding on a bigger platform so they can feel heard, and it has nothing to do with the actual issue. So I wonder, are we even like debating the issues anymore? And can we? Is there room for it?
I did think it was interesting that one of the people that they sort of profile who shows up all the time and makes a big scene is an actress.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, exactly. I mean, case in point.
Yeah, I think it's Coletta, to your point, in a way, it's a form of intimidation, right? Like,
oh, absolutely.
there is a threat that if you engage in this process in good faith, that bad things are going to happen to you, right? You're gonna get cursed out. You're gonna
there's
get death
actual
threats
too. Like they're people get death threats all the time, and like at the state legislature level, at the congressional level, it's very real, like daily,
Right.
like literal death threats.
And so for me, I think all of this keeps coming back to this idea of like why why is a volunteer in a small town city council showing up to get death threats from people who they are just offering their time and service free of charge to try and make their lives better, right? Like what is what is the point of this, right? And I think um, these public hearings or public forums are a participatory process that have like long roots in the mythos of the country, right? Like the
Mr. Smith goes to Washington, or like
yeah, like it is something that's very ingrained into the social culture and political culture, but social in the sense that this is how we meet each other and make decisions together, right? But I think it's also a process, looking at it through a planning lens, that has evolved a little bit in response to historic abuses and inequities. So you look at something like urban renewal or blight clearance, redlining, uh, highway construction, all of these processes were imposed externally by leaders and experts, um, some with good intentions and some with less good intentions, and all of which had major impacts on places and populations who didn't really have any platform within the existing process to fight back, right? And every urban planning student learns about, Arnstein's ladder of participation, right? And this is, if there is a religion in the field of urban planning, this is probably the closest thing to it. The idea that at the bottom you have non-participation, where a process is like manipulating or trying to coerce people into an outcome. And then there's tokenism, where people are informed or consulted or maybe placated. And then at the top, there's citizen control, where there's real partnership or delegation or even citizen control of the outcomes, right? And more is always better, right? There is this framework in which like the more agency and control that citizens have directly in their future, the more democratic the process will be and the better the outcomes we will see. Um,
That's very interesting to me.
right.
yeah, I have a
'Cause
variety of
I'm-
questions.
Yeah, I kind of feel like outside of urban planning, like sometimes more is absolutely not better. Like, how do you make a decision amongst 100 people? It's much easier to do that when there's only 2 people. Like, how do you move forward and actually come to a consensus when you don't agree on things?
Right.
So that, I
Well,
mean,
think
it just
this is-
seems difficult.
Right. But why, like, if we're thinking about why is this project delayed because there was another community meeting where another small constituency shouted down the speakers and no progress could be made? Why are elected officials getting yelled at in these meetings? I think part of it is coming from this reaction to these historic abuses. And the counterbalance to that is this direct community participation, and a strong deference to that sort of direct participation, because without it, without sort of meaningful engagement and control by citizens over their local decisions, bad things happen. Like inevitably, bad things happen. But this sort of direct and devolved citizen control of these processes, is not necessarily always an unmitigated and universal good. And I think this is where I get a little spicy, right? I think this is where maybe we're saying something controversial, or at least it feels controversial to me. And if you think it's absolutely not, then that's definitely my lens as an urban planner coming in, where this is something maybe you shouldn't traditionally think about, but now I'm thinking about more in the context of these public meeting disruptions. Is uh, is is this hyper delegated citizen control of process, does that get us the best and most democratic outcomes? And
Absolutely not.
yeah.
I don't think it's at all controversial. I mean, maybe it is. I mean, I would say the people that are calling people names would say so, but I think that their goal is not a democratic outcome. Their goal is to throw wrenches into the gears, right? Like they don't care.
Yeah, they're not trying to listen to the other people in the room. They're only trying to have themselves be heard. And I would think a democratic process would be, it's like, it's not just these people who are screaming. It's like,
The loudest people shouldn't always win, right?
absolutely. Or the people being, the most hateful, like.
But I guess what I want to look at a little more closely, though, is it's not always just that someone is drowning out the majority voices. Like sometimes the majority voices are also problematic, right? So I think about
Oh, for sure.
what does devolved citizen control look like in the context of something like Brown versus the Board of Education and school integration, right? Local devolved citizen control was implacable against the integration of schools and against the empowerment of minority groups in the communities. And it was often democratic in the sense that the decisions represented the desires of the majority. And sometimes it was directly democratic in the sense that there were referendums on whether it should happen. But it was also profoundly unjust, right? And so that's an extreme example. But, as someone who has spent decades working with local democracy, you begin to see all of these little ways that this model of direct participation can be undemocratic and unrepresentative and unjust. And we see just a few of those in this article.
Yeah, like Robert Moses was very popular as he, implemented infrastructure that has like racism built into its design, right? Like if people polled the audience or polled the electorate, like they would build that stuff. Maybe not in the sort of underhanded way that he did. I don't want to get into that too deeply, but like that's what I keep thinking of as when, the sort of undemocratic power that can happen without a process like this. But I have two framing mechanisms on this that I want to interrogate with you guys. One is leadership. So I was listening to, actually, interestingly enough, the 99% Invisible podcast is doing a book club read along of The Power Broker, about Robert Moses and his time, his tyranny of New York. And their guest in this last episode was Secretary of Transportation, Pete Buttigieg. And he was talking about kind of this topic about process and what leadership looks like. And that leadership is not just being reactionary. Leadership is sometimes being receptive and open to ideas that you could be wrong, but also having a vision and a value and trying to move us forward. And that's sort of, a tension with the public process. Like the public process is important and you need to be hearing people and being receptive and making people feel understood, but also you need to lead through change and have a vision. And I mean, if that doesn't work out, then there are electoral consequences for you. But leadership, how does this fit if you're a visionary leader who is elected with a mandate? And I feel like there's an America-Europe divide here too. You like elect a leader with some mandate, with some vision, and you let them do their job. How does this fit with leadership?
Yeah, I mean, that maybe was one of the biggest culture shocks for me living here was seeing that the local government would propose something for the benefit of the community. That's the same as the United States. Everyone had an opinion about it. That's the same as the United States. The people who were angry about it were very vocal about it. That's the same as the United States. There would be debates in the council chambers about what to do. That's the same. But what was different is that the local elected majority would say, okay, now we're going to do it. We're your elected officials, and you elected us with our election was the mandate to implement our vision for what the city should be. And in that capacity, we're going to do these things. And if you don't like it, vote us out next time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, is that is that less democratic? I think is an interesting question, but you can certainly see how it gets around those roadblocks to progress that loud and vocal minorities can place in front of city work.
Yeah.
I think there's also a piece here of like the people who speak up in any given political situation are usually the people who don't like it. Like your city council person is not going to get a bunch of phone calls saying like, good job on ordinance, whatever. That's exactly what I wanted. They're going to get phone calls saying, I hate this. This is stupid. And like, so I think there is a piece of real leadership is people knowing what they think is right and moving forward on that. And also being able to listen and recognize that they're not always going to be right. But I think there are certain things that like I think about like mask mandates in Kansas City. That was pretty controversial. And I was very happy that our mayor, who I don't always agree with, like kept that in place for a long period of time during a time when people were not vaccinated and we didn't know, what the hell was going on with COVID. Like, there's some strength in that and just knowing like this is a good thing to do. And I'm not going to like listen to all of the haters that are saying, I'm going to vote you out, and just being willing to risk that.
And there's doing the right thing in the sense that it is a conviction of the leader for what should happen. But what's interesting to me, and there's this tension in my work and in the profession, I think, there's also doing the right thing in the sense of doing what is objectively better at achieving some outcome, right? So
Yeah.
this might be a bold statement, but like it is possible to know things, right?
So
Like,
that was my other
Yes.
topic was, and I'll just tee it up and let you finish, Tess, but my leadership is the one thing I thought was imperiled by this problem, this epidemic of incivility. The other one is expertise. Like, if anyone can be a YouTube expert, what's the role of expertise?
right. So I think we have to start with just a basic axiom that it is possible to know things, right? We have data about the world. We can observe outcomes. We can be analytical and scientific about what is happening in our communities and about the consequences of our actions. And building on this understanding, we can know how our communities work, and we can know what policies or initiatives or actions will achieve whatever outcomes are desired, right? I think this is pretty fundamental for the existence of the planning profession, but also just for participatory democracy, to come back to the article, there is a shared objective reality that we can know and we can measure. And with that shared knowledge, we can make decisions about the future. And we may have different ideas about where we want to go, but there is a baseline for what is happening and what will happen if we do different things that shouldn't really be in question, and I think this is the context in which experts are important. It could be an epidemiologist talking about the spread of a pandemic, or a climatologist talking about climate change, or an engineer talking about whether the bridge will fall down if there's too much weight on it, right? There are experts who understand these complex systems that affect our lives, and they can share with the public and decision makers what are the actions that could lead to different sort of outcomes. So, like, this expertise exists. On the other hand, appeals to expertise or to esoteric knowledge are also part of that abuse of power that has shaped planning and participatory democracy, right? For many decades. How many meetings have you been in where a traffic engineer told you that this wouldn't work because of the average daily trips that a formula told him was going to happen on a road, right? And no matter how many different studies or observations you could put in front of them. So decisions are justified according to facts that aren't really facts, but are more like pretenses or prejudices, and that ultimately causes a lot of harm to people. And so today we see a lot of rejection of expertise, that is sort of a response to this history of disingenuous appeals to knowledge and imposing outcomes on people without a voice. And to avoid that, we have to be very cognizant that our knowledge isn't complete, it's not infallible, we have to be open to change. What we think is not necessarily universal all the time or in all places. But I think today it's sort of easier than ever for anyone to have an audience and a platform and to express themselves, and that sort of flattens this democratic process. So an expert who has spent decades learning the ins and outs of how something works, they are one voice among many with equal reach and equal audience. And then we have these sophisticated technology and propaganda tools that make it easier than ever to reframe what we know and reframe what is real, right? And so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, then everybody gets to be an expert, and Facebook's filter bubble made them fully prepared for every angle of this topic that is nowhere grounded in reality. I mean, that's the problem, is we're not living in the same reality, right? Where we used to talk about, do we want to build a curb cut on this corner? Now we're talking about whether science is real. It's just...
Yeah.
But I think and I think when you weave into that sort of fear and anxiety that we mentioned before, there's this, we're in an environment that is scary and difficult, and people are looking for ways to cope. And now we have these tools where intentionally or just through emergent activity, there's this manipulation through social media and technology about what information you have access to, and people are able to enter these bubbles of comforting and empowering information that becomes their reality. They're able to reframe what is real, right? And because we flattened this direct participatory democracy, that person who has that constructed reality has the same weight and voice as an expert who has, studied the world objectively for a long time. And so, I think that's where there's a phenomenon that's very hard to understand in the moment, but I think as we break it down, and we have today, it makes more sense. Where you go to a public meeting where a neighbor tells you something from Facebook that they believe is true because it's easier for them to live in a world where it is true. And even though they know you, or even though they can see it in front of them on their street, there's no amount of evidence or science or expertise or social connection that can sort of sway them, right? So that goes back to that, this idea of like trusting in your neighbors to work on local problems together has become this distrust of neighbors and friends and family because neighbors and friends and family are puncturing these realities, right? These constructed set of information and facts that are too difficult to deal with.
And
Yeah.
because a lot of it is being discussed online and not in person. You know what I mean? Like, even the city meeting that we're talking about, that's not like actually a discussion. It's a time for people to give testimony. And so it's meant, like, the setup is such that it's meant to be one person saying their little bit and then moving on and the next person saying their little bit, as opposed to like people in the community getting together and discussing this problem and having a real dialogue. Like, I don't think that we have dialogue in the world in the same way that our parents did.
No.
And, there's plenty of other things about the time period that we were younger that were much worse. But like, one of the problems with the modern world is that so much is discussed online and it's not face to face where we're actually trying to hear each other. It's just like typing at people and like reading it 20 minutes, 2 hours after the last comment got made, and like not having any sense of tone and just not hearing
Dehumanizing.
each other. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, there's all kinds of evidence that it, makes people angrier, and that like just the whole process of communicating online is not the way to actually communicate with other humans. But that's like it's the norm for most people, right? It's just I don't see too many situations where people are trying to change that. Like, I don't see very many situations where people are like really trying to get people together to like actually have a conversation about something.
I mean, it is kind of sacrilegious, right? To suggest that the tried and true public meeting, open house, uh, city hearing is not participatory, is not democratic, right? Like that is you're pulling at the foundations of society a little bit there. I think it's almost impossible for people to wrap their heads around the idea that um, that tool we have for us to work together no longer works given all of these other things that are true about the world now.
This is all reminding me, not to get like super specific, but one of the things, Tess, about the sort of individual facts, and you sort of mentioned the power of anecdote. Like, we can say like the world is changing, and then someone can say, yeah, well, yesterday though the world didn't change. So I mean, I saw it with my own eyes. You can't tell me it's different. So I testified for against a planning variance that would add a drive-through to an area where it's like a key pedestrian and bike corridor. So, and the planning department, this sort of threads all this together, because the planning department, the expertise, they did a really great job of like presenting all this historical background and the potential implications and the interventions that would be necessary to make this safe. I was really impressed with their work. That's another thankless job where they routinely get abused and ignored as experts. But I think their intention was to add context to the conversation, right? So like, here's the context of what we're discussing, and here are the facts on the ground, so we can all be anchored in this together, and then let's do the participatory process after that, based on that sort of context. And they might as well have not even wasted their time. And because everybody's like, well, yeah, okay, but that's true. But like, I stood out there for 20 minutes yesterday. I didn't see any bikes go by. So the bike lanes are useless or whatever. And it's just so depressing, because like everyone's just wasting their time talking past each other.
Because towards that thought of talking past each other, right? This idea that with enough analysis, with a good enough rationale, that you can persuade someone that what they think is not what is happening, right? Here is a rigorous process that has looked at objective data, and this is what it's told us, and aren't you convinced now, right? And it never works, right? And how come, right? And some of it we've been talking about, but there's YouTube philosopher Abigail Thorne, who I enjoy very much. One of her recent episodes, she talked about these like philosophical phantasms, which are these illusory phantasms that people create in order to misinterpret the world by projecting their feelings onto it. And so, in that process, avoiding cognitive dissonance, right, in the face of that fear or anxiety. And after seeing that video, I can't unsee it. In every public meeting or social media comment section or political debate, the bike lane makes me feel as if the neighborhood is gentrifying becomes the bike lane is gentrifying the neighborhood. Or I want the risk from the pandemic to be over becomes the risk from the pandemic is over.
Yeah.
Or I feel like immigrants threaten my way of life becomes immigrants threaten my way of life, right? And the root sources of this anxiety are real, but they're often like forbidden or inaccessible for these people to confront because of their society or religion or ideology or whatever, right? Like they're not permitted to unpack the causes and sources of these anxieties because to do so would puncture a lot of the stability that holds their lives together. And so those anxieties are transplanted to these phantasms that create this illusion of comfort or control over these things, and as we recently talked about my visit to Vienna, and I was walking through the World War II section of the Vienna Museum. There were all of these firsthand records, of the time of like anti-Semitism and genocide. And all of these things were these philosophical phantasms. They were anxieties about real things that people didn't have permission or the space to articulate or grapple with. And so they were transplanted to this, to specific groups of people or other sorts of beliefs that were more comforting to grapple with, And so,
Proxy concerns, like, or proxy issues that are
right.
symbols for
But
something bigger.
I guess walking through the museum, I was like, oh, like we have been here before,
Right.
many times, and it didn't go great, So I don't know. It's not a super encouraging way to like sort of put a button on this, but yeah, I think that's where my mind goes, is that we're a lot of this breakdown in these public meetings and this participatory democracy is because people are no longer sharing a reality together. And in the meantime, they are transplanting anxieties and fears to places where it's easy or comfortable to put them, with some really scary consequences on the horizon.
So
Absolutely.
that's a good transition, because I was going to say, I was going to go from there. Obviously, we could probably talk about this for hours, but to sort of bring us home and put a button on it, I was going to sort of ask what you were alluding to there, Tess, is this, how do we react to this? Do we get super nihilistic and just say there's nothing we can do and this is our new reality, and either the process is broken and we should stop trying and caring? Is this cyclical and that history goes in these cycles and that we just have to wait this out? I mean, we have some unprecedented, well, I mean, that word is overused these days, but like, COVID and the dehumanization of one another while we were all locked in it. Like, is this something that's just getting out of our bloodstream and that we can get back to something? Do we like mature out of social media? Like, there's so many questions, but like, how should we feel? What should we do? Where do we go from here? If you guys could solve that for me, I'll just sit back and listen. Thanks.
Well, I mean, other than move across the ocean, I suppose.
It's an option.
One,
Do you guys not have any
one,
conflicts over there?
yeah, it's a, I think the direct participatory democracy here is to barricade the streets and start setting things on fire. Um, but maybe that speaks to potential solutions, right? Like, I think a lot of the problems we have are because there are new processes, new technologies, new realities in the world, and we are trying to grapple with those using older tools for conversation that evolved out of a different set of circumstances, right? So I think part of the solution here is we probably need to begin thinking very deeply about what is representative participatory democracy. What are the ways that it can happen uh, in a manner that's just and equitable and representative. And that might mean some rethinking about how we engage with each other over the decisions that affect us all together.
Mm-hmm. This is not necessarily exactly relevant to that, but when you think about the modern messaging landscape, the fact that political candidates at the national level today have people in charge of making memes for their campaigns, it's just an acknowledgement that like the communication landscape is different. And so if you want to shape it, like you have to get in there and deal with those channels and that kind of propaganda and that kind of message strategy, as well as, use those tools to make the tent a little bit bigger. Coletta, what is your solution?
Well, I mean, speaking of memes, I think like one of my favorite positive memes that I like to try to, when I'm trying to be optimistic, think about is that Leslie Knope from Parks and Rec saying, so what I hear when I'm being yelled at is people caring really loudly at me, which I think is sometimes hard to like think of, but like there's an element to that is true, that like, as we have talked about, people are dealing with a lot and like this is coming from somewhere. But I do think that like the only solution I have is talking more to people, like, which sounds so simple, but I think the like part of me that went to hippie grad school where a lot of people were studying conflict resolution is that like we have to have more real conversations with people and conversations with people who are not on the same page as us from like a place of listening. I feel like I'm really echoey right now. Is that happening? But yeah, I feel like that's a hippie sort of thing to say, but I feel like we're so isolated in the modern world and like we can't get on the same page without being a little bit, I don't know, willing to like hear the other side. Or at least try to understand where the other side is coming from is probably a better way of putting that.
I mean, I'll take my responsibility as you were talking about that, Coletta. I was on the board of the neighborhood association here in our neighborhood. We have a business owner who is just always against everything urban, just wants free parking everywhere. We're trying to do parking management. And they, call the media to complain about parking being unfair. And I'm just like, those guys are just dicks. And I'm over them so much. And like the new vice president of the neighborhood went over there and talked to the guy and be like, look, do you know you have all these options? It's like, I understand this is challenging. And I'm like, just don't have the patience for that anymore. I'm part of the problem because I've been so jaded dealing with these kind of issues and trying to get through change and manage an evolution of a neighborhood that's going to evolve. Change is inevitable. That I could learn something from that too, to be like, try. And
that
again.
guy didn't know that he had all those options.
Yeah,
like that doesn't make him not an asshole, but like there was like a lack of understanding of what his options were, and so to have somebody who's like, look, trying to be nice and help him figure some things out maybe does smooth things over a little bit better.
I mean, it's a step in the right direction. It didn't stop him from still becoming problematic, but we keep trying. Anyway, all right. I think that was a great conversation. I think we'll check in on this later to see if we fixed it. But are there any parting shots we want to think? Any comments or big themes that we didn't touch on before we wrap up? Nope.
No. I mean, I think we could talk about this forever, but that's a lot
I
for
mean, I
people to
could I
listen
could
to.
tell you about each of the death threats I received as an urban planner so far in my career, but that felt like a morbid way to wrap up. So,
Were they all in the United States, I assume?
uh, yes, I don't have any clients over here yet.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, the fact that like Bike Walk had to like change their security posture and no longer have their door open during business hours so people could just walk in because they were worried about people coming in and threatening them because there's a lot of, we could go there. We could do a horror stories episode, but yeah, that's not very optimistic. But it extends your question test from why would anyone want to run for office to why would anyone want to do what is like, civil servant kind of professional work of being a planner. You're working in the interest of the public to try to make communities better for people to live in. Why would anyone do that if the thanks you get is a death threat or whatever? Like, and I think our key takeaway is like we want good leaders and we want good planners and we want good cities, and like good cities need good leaders and good planners. And so stop being a dick. That's our takeaway.
Well, and I we haven't been explicit about it, but maybe it's worth saying that like participatory democracy is important, is necessary, right? I strongly believe that the best outcome for our neighborhoods and our communities depends on um, a close connection with the values and aspirations of the people who live there. I don't think there's another way to do it. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
think there's an option where we are not engaging with each other. The question is how do we do so in a way that is functional and um, gets us to a better place.